It's April 1895, New York, and your lady's maid has been working since dawn, laying out every single gown you own. And now, your bedroom looks like a silk shop exploded, dresses cascading over chairs and settees, and the bed itself, and you're standing in the doorway feeling something you can't quite name. Is it dread? Shame? Exhaustion? Your maid looks up at you with an expression you've seen before, every April for the past 7 years, an expression that's part sympathy and part judgment, and she says quietly, "Shall we begin, ma'am?" "Begin what exactly?" You're looking at hundreds of dresses, afternoon gowns and evening gowns and walking suits and tea gowns, and most of them you've barely worn, some of them you've never worn at all. Some of them still have the dressmaker's tissue paper in the sleeve. You're looking at more clothes than most women will own in a lifetime, and your maid is asking if you're ready to begin. And you know what she means, but the word for it hasn't been spoken yet. The thing you're about to do hasn't been named, and there's a part of you that wants to delay it, wants to pretend for just a few more minutes that this isn't happening, but it is happening, because it's April, and April means decisions have to be made. Your maid picks up a pale blue afternoon dress, silk, with those sleeves that were so fashionable last spring, and she holds it up and looks at you, waiting. You wore this dress twice. You remember both times, the Vanderbilt garden party, the charity tea. $300 for a dress you wore twice, and now your maid is holding it up and waiting for you to tell her what to do with it. And you both know there's only one answer, but you're hesitating anyway, because $300 is $300. And the dress is perfect. It fits perfectly. There's nothing wrong with it except what? What's wrong with it? Why can't you just put it back in the wardrobe and wear it again? If you're listening with tired eyes and an overthinking mind, I'd love it if you'd subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos. That question, why can't you just wear it again? That's the question we need to answer. Because the answer explains everything about how New York society worked in 1895, about what it cost to maintain position, about why you're standing in a bedroom full of beautiful clothes feeling trapped instead of lucky. And the answer is complicated and absurd and exhausting, and it's going to cost you $10,000 this spring alone. And next spring it's going to cost you $10,000 again, and the spring after that, and the spring after that. And there's no way out of this cycle, no way to stop it, no way to say enough is enough without losing everything you've worked to build. Let me tell you about the spring purge of 1895, about what happened to all those beautiful dresses you could only wear once, about the rules that made the purge necessary, about the women who went bankrupt trying to keep up, and about why a pale blue silk dress that cost $300 and fits you perfectly is now something you can never, ever wear again. Your maid is still holding the pale blue dress, and you tell her to put it in the pile for alteration, which means it will go to the dressmaker, who will take it apart completely and remake it into something so different that no one could possibly recognize it as the dress you wore to the Vanderbilt garden party. And even then, you probably won't wear it in New York. You'll save it for when you're visiting your sister in Boston or your cousins in Philadelphia, cities that are far enough behind you. York fashion that what's unwearable here might still be acceptable there for another season or two. The alteration will cost almost as much as the original dress, maybe $200 to completely reconstruct it, but that's still cheaper than buying a new dress. And you're trying to be economical about this, even though the entire concept of economy seems absurd when you're standing in a room full of clothes you're throwing away. Your maid puts the blue dress in the alteration pile and picks up the next one, and you're settling into the rhythm of this now, the annual ritual of going through your entire wardrobe and making decisions about what stays and what goes and what gets transformed into something unrecognizable. You've divided your bedroom into sections, into piles that represent different fates for different garments, and your maid knows the system because she's done this with you every year. She knows which pile is which without you having to explain. There's the alteration pile for dresses that might be salvageable if they're completely remade. There's the charity pile for things that are too plain or too simple to be recognizably from a specific season, things that might be acceptable for women in settlements or for immigrant aid societies. Though even charity has its limits, because you can't be seen giving away clothes that are too distinctively yours, too obviously expensive, because that would suggest you're in financial trouble. There's the relative pile for dresses that can be sent to family members in other cities, though you have to be careful about this too, because you can't send your sister-in-law in Chicago something so outdated that it insults her, but you also can't send her something so current that it looks like you're showing off. There's the servant pile for things that can be altered down and given to your staff. Though again, this is complicated because your servants can't be seen wearing anything too fine or too recognizable, because it reflects badly on you if your maid is walking around in a dress that's obviously a hand-me-down from a society wardrobe. And then there's the destruction pile. And this is the one that makes you feel slightly sick every time you add something to it, because destruction means exactly what it sounds like. These dresses will be taken apart, and the fabric will be cut up into pieces too small to be recognized or reused, and the pieces will be burned or buried or otherwise disposed of, because these are the dresses that are so distinctively from last season, so recognizably yours, so documented in photographs, society columns, that they can't be allowed to exist anymore in any form that might be traced back to you. The rose-colored evening gown with the jet beading, the one that cost $700, and that you wore to one ball where you were photographed for Harper's Bazaar, that one goes directly to the destruction pile. There's no salvaging it, no altering it, no sending it to relatives, because that dress was documented. That dress was seen and recorded and published. And if anyone anywhere was seen in a dress that even resembled it, they would know immediately that it came from your wardrobe. And they would know that you were either so poor, you had to give away your ball gown, or so careless about your reputation that you'd let your cast-off circulate in public. So the rose gown has to be destroyed, $700 of silk and beading and labor has to be taken apart and cut up and eliminated, and you're trying not to think about what $700 means, about how that's more than your cook makes in 3 years, about how that's enough money to support a working-class family for months, about how you wore this dress for maybe 4 hours total, and now it has to be destroyed. Your maid moves to the next dress and the next and the next, and you're making decisions quickly now, because if you think too hard about any individual dress, you'll start to feel paralyzed by the waste and the absurdity of it. Alteration pile, charity pile, destruction pile, alteration pile, destruction pile. And the piles are growing and your wardrobe is shrinking, and you're mentally calculating how much money is represented in each pile and trying not to add it all up because the total will be devastating. But let's add it up anyway, because understanding the economics of the spring purge is the only way to understand why it was so impossible, why it trapped women in a cycle they couldn't escape. A society woman in New York in 1895 needed, at minimum, different outfits for every different type of social occasion, and the occasions were categorized very specifically. Morning dress for receiving calls before lunch, walking suit for promenading in the park, afternoon dress for teas and luncheons, tea gown for informal receiving at home, dinner dress for formal dinners, evening gown for balls and opera, not to mention traveling suits and sporting costumes and morning clothes and countless other specialized garments for specialized situations. And within each category, you needed multiple options because you couldn't be seen in the same morning dress every day. You couldn't wear the same walking suit every time you went to the park. You couldn't repeat the same tea gown week after week when you were receiving visitors. So for a single season, let's say spring, which runs roughly from March through June, you needed at least a dozen morning dresses, half a dozen walking suits, a dozen afternoon dresses, several tea gowns, multiple dinner dresses, and at least 4 or 5 evening gowns for major events, plus all the accessories that went with each outfit: hats, gloves, shoes, parasols, fans, jewelry. The cost for a single dress ranged from about $100 for something relatively simple to over $1,000 for an elaborate ball gown from a top Paris designer, with most quality dresses from good New York dressmakers running between $200 and $500. So if you're being conservative and buying mostly $200 dresses with a few fancier pieces for important events, you're spending roughly $8,000 to $10,000 per season just on the clothes themselves, not counting the hats and shoes and gloves and all the other accessories that are required to complete each outfit. And this is per season: spring, summer, fall, winter. 4 complete wardrobes per year, 4 rounds of acquisition and 4 rounds of purging, because you couldn't wear spring clothes in summer or summer clothes in fall. And by the time spring came around again, last spring's clothes were hopelessly outdated and had to be eliminated, just like you're eliminating them right now. The total annual cost of maintaining a proper society wardrobe in New York in 1895 was somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000, depending on how elaborate your social calendar was and how high-ranking your position. And this is just for clothes. This doesn't include jewels, or the cost of maintaining your house, or your servants, or your carriage, or your opera box, or any of the other expenses required to maintain position. $30,000 to $50,000 in 1895 is roughly equivalent to $1 to $1.5 million today, and that's what it cost just to have the right clothes to wear to events. That's not even counting what the events themselves cost if you were hosting them. And you couldn't economize. You couldn't cut corners. You couldn't decide to wear last season's dress just one more time because the rules were absolute. Here's why. New York society in 1895 was documented in a way that no previous society had ever been documented. There were society columns in every major newspaper. There were illustrated magazines like Harper's Bazaar and Godey's Ladies' Book that published fashion plates and photographs of society events. There were gossip sheets like Town Topics that made it their business to notice and comment on everything everyone wore. Your clothes were being recorded constantly, being written about, being photographed, being remembered, and that documentation meant you couldn't repeat without everyone knowing immediately that you were repeating if you wore the same dress to 2 balls in the same season. The society columns would mention it, sometimes explicitly, and sometimes with careful phrasing like Mrs. X appeared in a familiar rose silk, which everyone reading would understand meant she was wearing the same dress again, which meant she either couldn't afford new clothes or didn't care enough about her appearance to invest in proper ones, either of which meant her position was declining. If you wore a dress from a previous season, people would remember. They would recognize the silhouette or the fabric or the distinctive details, and they would know that you were wearing old clothes. And wearing old clothes meant you were falling behind, losing ground, no longer able to keep up with the pace of society. The pace was deliberately impossible. That was the point. The system was designed to be expensive and exhausting and unsustainable for anyone except the wealthiest families, because exclusivity required scarcity, and scarcity required barriers, and the most effective barrier was economic. Make it so expensive to participate that only the people who could afford to throw away $10,000 worth of clothes every season could maintain their position. Your maid has moved on to the evening gowns now, and these are the hardest, because evening gowns are the most expensive and the most documented. These are the dresses you wear to the events that matter, the balls and opera nights and important dinners. The events where photographers are present, and where your appearance will be recorded and published and remembered. You're looking at an emerald green velvet gown that cost $800 and that you wore to exactly one event, Mrs. Astor's New Year's ball, and that dress was photographed and mentioned in 4 different society columns and is therefore completely finished. It can never be worn again, not by you and not by anyone who might be connected to you. And so it goes into the destruction pile along with the rose gown and 3 other ball gowns that you wore once or twice to important events where you were photographed. That's $3,000 in the destruction pile, just from the ball gowns. $3,000 of fabric and beading and embroidery and labor that has to be eliminated because you wore them once in front of photographers. You're trying to think of this as an investment, as the cost of maintaining position, as money well spent, because those dresses served their purpose at those important events. But it's hard to maintain that perspective when you're watching your maid pile up gowns that are objectively beautiful, that fit you perfectly, that are in perfect condition, and that have to be destroyed simply because people remember seeing you wear them. And the cruelty of this system, the thing that makes it particularly devastating, is that you can't even enjoy the clothes while you have them. You can't take pleasure in wearing them multiple times. You can't develop a relationship with a favorite dress or a beloved gown, because every time you wear something, you're depleting its value, you're using up its usefulness, you're moving it one step closer to the purge pile. Every event you attend, every photograph taken, every society column mention is reducing your wardrobe's worth, turning expensive dresses into disposable items and transforming your investment into waste. So you end up never wearing some things at all because you're saving them for the right event, the perfect occasion, the moment when that particular dress will make the right impression, and then the season ends and the moment never came, and you have a dress you never wore that's now outdated and unwearable and has to be purged anyway. There are 4 dresses in your current wardrobe that you never wore, not even once. 4 dresses that cost a combined $1,500, and that seemed perfect when you ordered them, but somehow the right occasions never materialized, or the weather changed, or you decided at the last minute that something else was more appropriate. And now those dresses are going into various piles, one to alteration, one to a relative, two to destruction, $1,500 that you never even got, to use before it became obsolete. Your maid is asking you about the tea gowns now, and these are slightly less fraught because tea gowns are worn at home for informal receiving, so they're less likely to be photographed or documented in society columns, which means some of them might be salvageable for another season if you're careful about when and how you wear them. But even tea gowns have their limits, because your friends will remember what you wore when they came to call. They'll notice if you're wearing the same thing too often. They'll make mental notes about whether your wardrobe seems to be refreshing at the appropriate rate. And those mental notes become gossip, and gossip becomes reputation, and reputation is everything. So you're conservative with the tea gowns. You're keeping 2 that are plain enough to be relatively timeless. You're altering 3 that are too distinctive to wear as is, but that might work if they're completely reconstructed. You're sending 2 to your sister in Boston, and you're putting 3 into destruction because they were featured in the background of photographs taken at your at-home days and are therefore documented and finished. The walking suits are easier because those genuinely do wear out from actual use, from walking in the park and riding in carriages, and the general wear of being outdoor clothes. So some of them are going to servants or charity, not because they're outdated, but because they're actually worn enough that they need to be. But even here you have to be careful because a walking suit from last season has last season's silhouette, last season's sleeve shape, last season's skirt length, and if you're seen in an obviously outdated silhouette, it marks you as someone who's not keeping up with fashion, which marks you as someone who's not keeping up with society, which marks you as someone whose position is slipping. This is what makes the system so exhausting, the fact that it's not enough to have money and spend money. You have to spend money at exactly the right pace, in exactly the right way, on exactly the right things, and the pace keeps accelerating and the requirements keep expanding, and you can never rest. You can never say this is enough. You can never step off the treadmill without falling behind everyone else who's still running. And women did fall behind. Women did go bankrupt trying to keep up with the pace of the Purge cycle, and let me tell you about some of them, because their stories explain what happened when you couldn't afford to throw away $10,000 worth of clothes every season. There was Mrs. K, wife of a successful lawyer, who'd been in New York society for about 5 years, and who seemed to be maintaining her position adequately until suddenly she wasn't, until people started noticing that she was wearing dresses they'd seen before, that her wardrobe wasn't refreshing at the appropriate rate, that she was appearing at events in gowns that were recognizably from previous season. The gossip started quietly, just mentions in society columns about familiar silks and oft-seen ensembles, but gossip has a way of accelerating and intensifying, and within a season it was openly discussed that Mrs. K couldn't afford proper clothes, which meant her husband's law practice must be struggling, which meant other lawyers started avoiding him professionally because no one wants to be associated with failure, which became a self-fulfilling prophecy because his practice actually did start struggling once the gossip began. Mrs. K tried to fix it, tried to catch up, took out loans to finance a complete new wardrobe, spent $20,000 in one season trying to prove that the gossip was wrong, that she could afford to keep up, that her position was secure. But $20,000 in one season when you're already in debt is devastating, and her husband's practice couldn't support it, and within a year they'd moved out of their Fifth Avenue house into something smaller in a less fashionable neighborhood, and within 2 years they'd left New York entirely for Chicago, where the pace was slower and the requirements were less demanding, and Mrs. K could maintain a position with a fraction of the wardrobe. The tragedy of Mrs. K's story is that if she'd been able to maintain the Purge cycle, if she'd been able to keep spending the $10,000 per season that was required, she probably would have been fine. Her husband's practice would have remained stable, their position would have held, but she couldn't. And the moment she started economizing, the moment she started wearing things twice or keeping dresses for 2 seasons instead of 1, the system punished her for it, marked her as failing, and turned the perception of failure into actual failure. Then there was Mrs. L, whose husband made a fortune in railroads and who entered New York society with enormous enthusiasm and unlimited funds, and who thought that having unlimited funds meant she could simply buy her way into permanent position. She spent extravagantly. She threw away clothes after wearing them once. She commissioned new wardrobes constantly. She was written up in society columns as one of the best-dressed women in New York. And for about 3 years, this strategy seemed to work. She was invited everywhere. She was photographed constantly. She was accepted into the inner circles of society. But her husband's railroad investments started to decline. The returns weren't what they'd been. The fortune that had seemed unlimited turned out to have limits after all. And Mrs. L was faced with a choice: maintain the wardrobe spending and deplete their capital, or economize on clothes and risk her social position. She chose to economize. She tried to be strategic about it. She still spent money, but she spent less. She started wearing things 2 or 3 times. She started altering dresses instead of destroying them. She tried to make one season's wardrobe stretch into the next. It didn't work. The society columns noticed immediately. The gossip started, and within 1 season, Mrs. L went from being one of the best-dressed women in New York to being someone who was clearly economizing, which meant someone who was clearly declining, which meant someone who was no longer worth cultivating or inviting or including. The invitations slowed, then stopped, and Mrs. L found herself on the outside of the circles she'd spent 3 years and probably $200,000 to enter, and all because she tried to economize on clothes. The cruelest part of Mrs. L's story is that her husband's business actually recovered after a few years. The railroad investment started paying off again. They had money again, but by then it was too late. By then, Mrs. L had been marked as someone who'd failed to maintain standards, and even with unlimited funds, again, she couldn't buy her way back into the position she'd lost. Society has a long memory for failure and a short memory for success. And once you've been seen economizing on clothes, once you've been seen falling behind, the stain of that failure persists, even after the financial situation that caused it has resolved. These stories, Mrs. K and Mrs. L and dozens of others like them, these are what you're thinking about as you stand in your bedroom making decisions about which dresses to destroy and which to salvage, because you understand that you're one bad investment away from being them, one financial setback away from having to economize, one season of wearing things 2 away from starting the gossip that could destroy your position. The spring purge isn't optional. It's not extravagance. It's survival. It's the price you pay to avoid becoming a cautionary tale. Your maid has finished going through all the dresses now, and you're looking at the piles she's organized, and you're doing the math in your head about what each pile represents. The alteration pile is about 15 dresses that will cost roughly $200 each to remake, so $3,000 in alteration cost. The charity pile is maybe 20 dresses that have no resale or alteration value, but that are too good to destroy. The relative pile is 10 dresses that you're sending to your sister and your cousins and your sister-in-law. The servant pile is a dozen dresses that will be altered down for your staff. And the destruction pile is 8 dresses, ball gowns mostly, that cost a combined $5,000 and that have to be eliminated completely. So you spent roughly $10,000 on this spring wardrobe last year, and you're salvaging maybe $3,000 worth through alteration, and you're losing $7,000 to charity and relatives and servants and destruction, which means you got 1 season of use out of $7,000 worth of clothes, and now you have to spend another $10,000 to replace them for this spring. And next year, you'll do this all over again. The cycle never stops, the treadmill never slows, and there's no way out of it as long as you want to maintain your position in New York society. And this isn't even counting the other 3 seasons. This is just spring. This is just 1/4 of your annual wardrobe budget, and you're already exhausted thinking about it. Your maid asks if you're ready to start on the hats and the shoes and the gloves, all the accessories that also have to be purged and replaced with each season. And you tell her yes, you might as well finish this now. Might as well complete the entire ritual in one devastating session. The hats are relatively easy because hats genuinely do get damaged from wear and weather. But the shoes are harder because you have dozens of pairs of shoes that you wore once or twice, shoes that were dyed to match specific dresses, and that are therefore useless now that those dresses are being purged, and you're looking at maybe $100 worth of shoes that are going directly to destruction because they can't be worn with anything else. The gloves are the worst because gloves are expensive and fragile, and you go through dozens of pairs per season because they soil quickly and can't be worn soiled. So you're constantly buying new gloves at $2 or $3 a pair, and at the end of the season, you have drawers full of slightly soiled gloves that can't be cleaned well enough to wear again, but that seemed too good to throw away. So they sit in drawers, taking up space, and making you feel guilty about the waste, until finally you tell your maid to just get rid of them, to give them to servants, or charity, or destruction. Whatever makes sense. You can't think about gloves anymore. By the time the purge is finished, it's late afternoon, and your bedroom looks ransacked. There are empty wardrobes and trunks being packed, and piles of clothing everywhere waiting to be transported to their various fates. And you're exhausted not just from the physical work of going through everything, but from the emotional work of making all these decisions, of calculating all these costs, of confronting all this waste, and feeling simultaneously guilty about the excess, and terrified about the necessity of it. Your maid asks if you'd like tea, and you say yes, and you go downstairs to your drawing room and try to think about something else. Try to not calculate how much money is currently being packed into trunks upstairs. Try to not think about the fact that you're going to have to do this again in 3 months when summer ends, and then again in 3 months when fall ends, and then again in 3 months when winter ends, forever. Or at least until you're too old to participate in society. Or until your husband's business fails, or until something breaks this cycle that seems unbreakable. And here's the thing that's easy to miss if you're looking at this from the perspective of the 21st century. The spring purge and the constant wardrobe churn wasn't about vanity. It wasn't about women being frivolous or shallow or obsessed with fashion. It was about survival in a system where your social position determined everything from your children's marriage prospect to your husband's business relationships to your family's entire future, and where social position was maintained through constant visible consumption that proved you had the resources to participate. Fashion was the marker, the visible signal that you belonged, and the speed of fashion turnover was the barrier that kept people out. Because if you couldn't afford to throw away $10,000 worth of clothes every season, then you couldn't afford to participate in the society that determined whether your daughters married well or married down, whether your sons got into the right clubs, whether your husband got the business connections he needed, whether your family maintained position or slipped into obscurity. The spring purge was the tax you paid for access to power, and the tax was deliberately set high enough that most people couldn't afford it. Because that's how exclusive societies maintain exclusivity. They create barriers that are nominally about taste or fashion or knowing the right rules, but that are actually about money, about who can afford to waste enough resources to prove they belong. And you couldn't opt out. You couldn't decide the game wasn't worth playing, because opting out meant losing position, which meant losing the only form of power that women in 1895 had access to, which was social power, which was the ability to arrange marriages and make connections and maintain family position through the careful management of reputation and relationships. So you played the game, you participated in the purge, you threw away $7,000 worth of perfectly good clothes every spring, and you bought $10,000 worth of new clothes to replace them, and you did it with a smile, and you made it look effortless, and you never complained about the waste or the expense or the exhaustion, because complaining would mark you as someone who wasn't comfortable with the requirements, which would mark you as someone who might not be able to maintain the pace, which would mark you as someone whose position might be slipping. You're sitting in your drawing room drinking tea, and you can hear your servants upstairs packing trunks with the purged wardrobe, and you're thinking about the $10,000 you're about to spend at dressmakers and milliners and shoemakers to rebuild your spring wardrobe, and you're thinking about the fact that you'll spend another $10,000 in summer, and another $10,000 in fall, and another $10,000 in winter, and you're thinking that $40,000 a year just for clothes is more money than most families will see in a decade, more money than some families will see in a lifetime. And you're also thinking that you don't have a choice, that this is what it costs to be who you are and maintain what you have, that the spring purge and the constant consumption and the waste and the exhaustion are simply the price of admission to the only world where you have any power at all. Your maid comes downstairs with the final tally, the official accounting of what's been purged and where everything is going, and she tells you that the dressmaker will need 2 weeks for the alterations, that the trunks for your sister and your cousins will go out on tomorrow's train, that the charity organizations will send someone to collect their items, that the destruction pile will be handled discreetly. She doesn't mention the cost because she doesn't need to. You both know what this cost. You both know what it will cost to replace everything. You both know this is just the spring purge, and there will be 3 more before the year is over. You thank her, and she goes back upstairs to finish the packing, and you sit in your drawing room with your tea getting cold thinking about cycles and treadmills and systems designed to be impossible to maintain, and you're wondering how much longer you can keep this up, how many more spring purges you have in you, how many more seasons of buying and wearing and destroying before something gives, before you either have to economize and risk your position or keep spending and risk your husband's business or find some third option that you can't quite imagine right. But there is no third option. That's what makes this so devastating. There's only the cycle and your participation in it. There's only the spring purge and the fall purge and the summer purge and the winter purge. There's only the constant acquisition and the constant disposal, the constant performance of consumption that proves you belong in a world that requires constant proof. The spring purge of 1895 is over for this year. Your wardrobe has been sorted and packed and sent to its various destinations. And next week, you'll start the process of rebuilding it, of visiting dressmakers and choosing fabrics and being fitted for the new season's clothes that you'll wear for a few months before purging them too. And next April, you'll do this all over again. And the April after that, and the April after that, until eventually the system changes or you opt out or you can't afford to keep up anymore. But for now, you're sitting in your drawing room and your bedroom upstairs is nearly empty, and your wardrobe for next season doesn't exist yet. And you're in this strange liminal space between the old clothes and the new clothes, between last season and this season, between the waste you just created and the waste you're about to create, and you're so tired. You're so tired of the cycle and the performance and the constant vigilance about what you're wearing and whether you've worn it before and whether it's still fashionable enough and whether people are noticing and judging and documenting. You're tired of treating clothes like disposable items when they cost more than most people earn in a year. You're tired of the spring purge and everything it represents about the impossible standards of the world you live in. But being tired doesn't change anything. Being tired doesn't stop you out. Being tired just means you're tired while you continue doing exactly what you've always done, because the alternative is losing everything. So next week you'll go to the dressmaker and you'll order new gowns and you'll smile and you'll pretend this is all perfectly normal, perfectly reasonable, perfectly sustainable. And next April you'll stand in your bedroom again surrounded by another season's worth of clothes that have to be purged, and you'll go through the same ritual, make the same calculations, feel the same exhaustion, and the cycle will continue because that's what cycles do. They continue, they never stop, they just keep turning and turning and turning until something breaks. Sweet dreams. And if you dream tonight of bedrooms full of silk and satin, of trunks being packed and dresses being destroyed, of the endless cycle of acquiring and discarding, remember that the spring purge is over, that the Gilded Age ended, that the system that demanded constant consumption and constant waste eventually collapsed under its own absurdity. Remember that the women who lived through it did what they had to do to survive, that they participated in the cycle because the alternative was losing position and power and security, that they were tired too, but they kept going because that's what was required. The bedroom is empty now, the wardrobe is purged, and you can rest knowing that at least this April's ritual is finished. At least for this year, the decisions have been made, and the clothes have been sorted, and the waste has been quantified and packed away. Next year will bring another purge, but next year isn't here yet. And for tonight, you can sleep without thinking about pale blue silk dresses, or rose-colored ball gowns, or the $10,000 you're about to spend to fill the empty spaces they left behind.